The champagne flowed like water through the halls of the Westbrook estate, one of the most magnificent properties in all of Connecticut. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors imported from Italy. Original artwork worth millions adorned walls that had witnessed a century of high society gatherings. The estate sprawled across 12 acres of manicured grounds, complete with formal gardens, a reflecting pool, and a carriage house that had been converted into a guest residence worth more than most people's primary homes. The mansion itself was a masterpiece of Gilded Age architecture, built in 1892 by a railroad baron who had wanted to create a monument to his success. Over the decades, it had passed through several prominent families, each leaving their mark on the property. The current iteration featured a grand ballroom that could accommodate 300 guests, a library containing over 10,000 volumes, and a wine cellar that was the envy of collectors worldwide. Tonight, the mansion played host to the Hartwell Foundation's annual Summer Gala, a charity event that attracted the wealthiest and most influential families on the East Coast. Men in tailored tuxedos and women dripping in diamonds mingled beneath the soaring ceilings of the grand ballroom, their laughter echoing off surfaces that had been polished to perfection. The guest list read like a who's who of Connecticut society. Investment bankers and hedge fund managers rubbed shoulders with old money families whose fortunes predated the Civil War. Politicians seeking campaign contributions worked the room alongside celebrities seeking social cachet. It was the kind of event where deals were made, alliances were forged, and reputations were built or destroyed with a single careless word. Among the glittering crowd moved a woman who drew no attention whatsoever. She wore simple black slacks and a plain white blouse, her graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. In her hands, she carried a silver tray, collecting empty glasses and discarded napkins with quiet efficiency. Her name was Eleanor Washington, and she moved through the crowd like a ghost, invisible to the wealthy guests who barely registered her presence as she cleaned up after them. Eleanor was 62 years old, with kind brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled, and hands that showed the wear of decades of hard work. She had a warm face, the kind that made strangers feel comfortable, and a calm demeanor that suggested nothing could ruffle her feathers. Tonight, she wore no jewelry except for a simple gold band on her right hand, a ring that had belonged to her grandmother, passed down through 4 generations of Washington women. Her grandmother had been a sharecropper's daughter in Mississippi, born just 30 years after the end of slavery. Her mother had migrated north during the Great Migration, seeking better opportunities in Chicago. Eleanor herself had been born in the Robert Taylor Homes, one of the largest public housing projects in the country, surrounded by poverty and violence and the crushing weight of systemic disadvantage. The Robert Taylor Homes had been a city unto itself, a vertical ghetto of concrete towers stretching toward a sky that always seemed grey and distant. 28 buildings, each 16 stories tall, housing over 27,000 people in conditions that would have been condemned anywhere else. Gang violence was a daily reality. Drug dealers operated openly in the stairwells. The elevators rarely worked, and when they did, they smelled of urine and despair. Eleanor had shared a 2-bedroom apartment with her mother, her 3 brothers, and for a time, her grandmother before she passed. They slept 3 to a bed, ate meals stretched thin to make them last, wore clothes handed down until they fell apart. Her mother worked as a maid during the day, cleaned offices at night, and took in laundry on weekends, somehow finding the energy to help her children with their homework and make sure they said their prayers before bed. "Education is the way out," her mother would say over and over like a mantra. "They can take everything else from you, but they can't take what's in your mind. You get yourself an education, and you'll be free, really free in a way I never was." Eleanor had taken those words to heart. She had studied by flashlight when the power was cut off, done her homework in the stairwell when the apartment was too crowded and loud. She had walked 2 miles each way to a magnet school that offered better opportunities, refusing the easier path of the local schools where students routinely dropped out, or worse. Her brothers hadn't been as lucky. Marcus, the oldest, had joined a gang at 15 and was dead by 20, shot in a dispute over territory that meant nothing and cost everything. James had turned to drugs to escape the pain of their circumstances and spent most of his adult life cycling through prisons and rehab facilities. Only David, the youngest, had followed Eleanor's path, eventually becoming a high school teacher in the same neighborhood where they'd grown up. These losses had shaped Eleanor as much as her successes. She carried her brothers with her, the one who had died too young and the one who had lost himself to addiction. She thought about them when she made hiring decisions, when she funded rehabilitation programs, when she spoke to young men who reminded her of Marcus and James before everything went wrong. But you wouldn't know any of that to look at her now, moving silently through the crowd with her tray of dirty glasses. You would see only what she wanted you to see: a servant, a nobody, someone beneath notice. She paused near a group of young men clustered around the bar, their voices loud with alcohol and privilege. They were the sons of old money, trust fund babies who had never worked a day in their lives and saw no reason to start. Their leader, the one holding court at the center of the group, was a man named Bradley Hartwell III. Bradley was 34 years old and had never heard the word no in his entire life. He was handsome in that generic way that came from good genes and better plastic surgeons, with perfectly styled blonde hair and teeth that had cost his father $50,000 to straighten. He wore a custom Brioni tuxedo that had been fitted specifically for his athletic frame and a Patek Philippe watch worth more than most people earned in a year. His education had been impeccable on paper: Exeter for prep school, Yale for undergraduate, Harvard Business School for his MBA. But the reality behind those credentials was less impressive. Tutors had written most of his papers. Donations had smoothed over academic difficulties. Legacy admissions had guaranteed his acceptance at every step. He had never earned anything in his life, but he had been taught from birth that everything was his by right. He was also, by any objective measure, a terrible human being. His romantic history was a graveyard of broken hearts and settled lawsuits. 3 women had accused him of assault over the years, but each case had disappeared after his family's lawyers got involved, buried under non-disclosure agreements and cash payments. He had destroyed the careers of employees who displeased him, using his family's connections to ensure they could never work in their industries again. He had ruined friendships on a whim, betrayed confidences for amusement, and left a trail of destruction everywhere he went. But in the rarefied world of Connecticut high society, none of that mattered. What mattered was the family name, the family fortune, the family power, and the Hartwells had all 3 in abundance. And then, Bradley was saying, his voice carrying across the room, I told her that if she wanted to keep her job, she'd better learn to smile more. You know how these people are, always complaining about something. His friends laughed, the obsequious laughter of men who knew their social standing depended on staying in Bradley's good graces. The Hartwell family was old money, their fortune built on railroads and banking and the kind of business dealings that didn't bear close examination. Bradley's father, Bradley Hartwell II, was one of the most powerful men in Connecticut politics, and his son had grown up believing that power was his birthright. Eleanor moved closer, reaching for an empty champagne flute that had been abandoned on a nearby table. She kept her eyes down, her movements quiet and unobtrusive. She had learned long ago that invisibility was a kind of armor, that the less attention she drew, the smoother her evening would go. But Bradley noticed her anyway. "Hey!" he called out, snapping his fingers in her direction. "You!" "Cleaning lady." Eleanor looked up, her expression neutral. "Yes, sir." "My glass is empty." He thrust his champagne flute toward her, not bothering to walk the 3 steps that separated them. "Get me another one, And make it quick. I don't have all night." "Of course, sir." Eleanor set down her tray and reached for his glass. As she did, one of Bradley's friends jostled her elbow, causing her to stumble slightly. The empty glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the marble floor. The sound cut through the ambient noise of the party, drawing glances from nearby guests. Eleanor immediately dropped to her knees, beginning to gather the broken pieces with practiced efficiency. "Unbelievable," Bradley said, his voice dripping with contempt. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You people can't do anything right." Eleanor looked up at him, her brown eyes meeting his blue ones. There was no anger in her gaze, no defensiveness, just a calm, steady regard that seemed to see right through him. "I apologize, sir. I'll have this cleaned up immediately." "You'd better." Bradley turned back to his friends, shaking his head in exaggerated disbelief. "Can you believe they let people like this work at events like this? You'd think the Westbrooks would have higher standards." Eleanor said nothing. She continued gathering the broken glass, her movements careful and methodical. A younger server hurried over with a dustpan and brush, kneeling beside her to help. "Are you okay, Miss Washington?" the young man whispered, his eyes darting nervously toward Bradley and his group. "I'm fine, Marcus," Eleanor said softly. "These things happen, but the way he spoke to you—" "Hush now. Let's just get this cleaned up." They finished quickly, and Eleanor rose to her feet, brushing off her slacks. She picked up her tray and moved away from Bradley's group, disappearing into the crowd as if she had never been there at all. But she hadn't gone far when she heard Bradley's voice again, louder this time, clearly intended to be overheard. "The problem with this country," he was saying, "is that we've forgotten how things are supposed to work. There's a natural order, you know? Some people are meant to lead, and some people are meant to serve. It's just biology, nothing personal." His friends nodded along, though a few of them had the grace to look uncomfortable. One of them, a man named Thomas Whitfield, glanced in the direction Eleanor had gone and frowned. "Maybe keep it down, Brad," Thomas suggested quietly. "You've had a lot to drink." "I've had exactly as much as I want to have," Bradley replied, his voice rising. "And I'll say exactly what I want to say. This is America, freedom of speech. Or did you forget?" He grabbed a fresh glass of champagne from a passing server, taking a long drink before continuing his monologue. The alcohol had loosened his tongue and quieted whatever small voice of restraint might normally have tempered his words. "My father always said that the problem with the help these days is that they've forgotten their place. Used to be people knew where they stood. Now everyone wants to be special. Everyone wants a trophy. Well, I've got news for them. Some people are just meant to clean up other people's messes. That's just the way it is." Eleanor had paused near a pillar, ostensibly adjusting the items on her tray, but in reality listening to every word. Her face remained impassive, but something flickered in her eyes. Not anger exactly, something more complex, something that looked almost like anticipation. The gala continued around her. Couples danced to the string quartet playing in the corner. Waiters circulated with trays of hors d'oeuvres that cost more per piece than many families spent on a week of groceries. The wealthy and powerful of Connecticut society laughed and schemed and congratulated themselves on their generosity, having paid $5,000 per plate to attend this charity event. The charity in question was the Hartwell Foundation, ostensibly dedicated to providing educational opportunities for underprivileged youth. In reality, it was a tax shelter that allowed the Hartwell family to move money around while generating positive publicity. The actual amount that reached the intended beneficiaries was a tiny fraction of what was raised, most of it eaten up by administrative costs and overhead. Eleanor knew all of this. She knew far more than anyone at this party suspected. The evening wore on. Bradley continued drinking, his behavior becoming increasingly erratic. He made inappropriate comments to several of the female guests, comments that were laughed off because of who his family was. He knocked over a display of silent auction items and barely apologized. He cornered a young server and berated her for bringing him the wrong kind of canapé. Through it all, Eleanor watched. She moved through the crowd, invisible and attentive, her eyes missing nothing. It was nearly 11 o'clock when the incident occurred. Eleanor was crossing the main ballroom, carrying a tray laden with empty glasses, when Bradley stepped directly into her path. He was very drunk now, swaying slightly on his feet, his face flushed and his eyes glassy. "You again?" he said, looking down at her with an expression of disgust. "Are you following me around or something? Because I've got to tell you, it's getting creepy." "I'm just doing my job, sir," Eleanor replied calmly. "If you'll excuse me." She tried to step around him, but Bradley moved to block her path. His friends had gathered behind him, watching the scene unfold with the eager anticipation of men who enjoyed seeing others humiliated. "Your job," Bradley repeated, drawing out the words. "Right. Your job is to serve people like me, to clean up our messes, to stay out of sight until we need something. Is that so hard to understand?" "No, sir. It's not hard at all." "Then why do you keep getting in my way?" Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I believe you stepped into my path, sir. I was simply crossing the room." Something dark flashed across Bradley's face. He wasn't used to being contradicted, even gently. His entire life, people had agreed with him, deferred to him, made way for him. This quiet woman with her tray of dirty glasses was disrupting the natural order of things, and it infuriated him. "Are you talking back to me?" His voice rose, drawing attention from nearby guests. "Do you have any idea who I am? Do you have any idea who my father is?" "I'm aware of who you are, Mr. Hartwell." "Then you should know better than to disrespect me." Bradley grabbed a glass from a passing waiter, a fresh martini that had been destined for another guest. "You want to act like you're better than me? You want to stand there with that look on your face like you're judging me?" "I'm not judging you, sir. I'm simply trying to do my work." "Well, here's some more work for you." And with that, Bradley Hartwell III threw his martini directly into Eleanor Washington's face. The room went silent. The liquid splashed across Eleanor's features, soaking her blouse, dripping from her chin onto the marble floor. Olive juice stung her eyes. Vodka ran down her cheeks like tears. She stood perfectly still, not flinching, not crying out, not moving at all. For a long moment no one spoke. The string quartet stopped playing. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every eye in the room turned toward the scene unfolding near the center of the ballroom. Bradley laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the sudden silence. "Now you look more like what you are," he said. "Maybe now you'll remember your place." His friends laughed too, though nervously, sensing that something had shifted in the atmosphere of the room. The other guests stared in horror, frozen in that peculiar paralysis that often grips witnesses to cruelty. Eleanor raised one hand and slowly wiped the liquid from her eyes. When she opened them again, she looked at Bradley with an expression that made him take an involuntary step backward. It wasn't anger. It wasn't humiliation. It was something else entirely. Something that looked almost like pity. "Are you finished?" she asked quietly. Bradley blinked, confused by her composure. He had expected tears, perhaps. Shouting. The satisfying spectacle of a woman he considered beneath him breaking down in public. Instead, she stood before him with a dignity that made his expensive tuxedo feel like a costume. "What did you say to me?" "I asked if you were finished. Because if you are, I believe there are some things you should know." "I don't need to know anything from someone like you." Eleanor smiled. It was a small smile, but it transformed her face entirely. Suddenly, she didn't look like a cleaning lady at all. She looked like something else, something more. "My name is Eleanor Washington," she said, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "And I am the owner of this house." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Bradley's face went from flushed to pale in the space of a heartbeat. That's impossible," he stammered. "The Westbrooks own this estate. Everyone knows that. The Westbrooks sold this estate 18 months ago," Eleanor replied calmly. "To me. I purchased it with cash. The full asking price of $47 million. A murmur ran through the crowd. People began whispering to each other, pulling out phones, checking facts. Someone gasped. "You're lying," Bradley said, but his voice had lost its conviction. "You're some kind of... I don't know what you're trying to pull, but..." "I'm not trying to pull anything, Mr. Hartwell." Eleanor reached up and began removing the pins that held her hair in its severe bun. As she did, her grey hair tumbled down around her shoulders, and she shook it out with a casual grace that spoke of comfort in her own skin. "I am Eleanor Washington, founder and CEO of Washington Dynamics. Perhaps you've heard of it." Bradley's face went from pale to grey. Washington Dynamics was one of the largest defense contractors in the country, a multi-billion-dollar corporation that had started as a small engineering firm 40 years ago and grown into an industry giant. Its founder was famously reclusive, rarely photographed, known only as a self-made billionaire who had risen from poverty to become one of the wealthiest people in America. That can't be. "I grew up in a housing project in Chicago," Eleanor continued, her voice steady and clear. "My mother worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. My father died when I was 7, shot in a robbery gone wrong, leaving my mother alone with 4 children and no life insurance. I put myself through college on scholarships and determination, studying by candlelight when we couldn't pay the electric bill. I started my company with $1,000 and an idea, working out of my kitchen while I raised 2 children on my own." The room was absolutely silent now. Even the servers had stopped moving, transfixed by the scene unfolding before them. "I remember the first time I cleaned a house for money," Eleanor continued. "I was 12 years old. A white woman in our neighborhood needed help preparing for a party. She paid me $5 for 6 hours of work. I scrubbed her floors on my hands and knees. I polished her silver until my fingers ached. And when I was finished, she looked at what I had done and said it wasn't good enough. She said I would never amount to anything, that people like me were only good for manual labor." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I thought about that woman for years. I thought about her every time someone told me I couldn't do something. Every time someone looked at me and saw only my skin color, only my poverty, only my circumstances. I used her voice as fuel. Every time she whispered in my ear that I would never amount to anything, I worked harder, pushed further, proved her wrong in ways she could never have imagined." She began unbuttoning her plain white blouse, revealing underneath it a simple but clearly expensive silk shell. She removed the blouse entirely and handed it to a stunned Marcus, who took it automatically. "I know what it is to serve, Mr. Hartwell. I spent years cleaning houses, waiting tables, doing whatever honest work I could find to support my family. There is no shame in service. The shame belongs to those who look down on the people who serve them." She stepped closer to Bradley, and he flinched backward as if she had raised a hand to strike him. "I dress like this sometimes because it helps me see the truth about people. When they think I'm nobody, when they think I have nothing, they show me who they really are. And you, Mr. Hartwell, have shown me exactly who you are tonight." The room had erupted into a frenzy of whispered conversations. People were showing each other their phones, pulling up articles and photographs. The few pictures that existed of Eleanor Washington, reclusive billionaire, showed a woman in elegant clothing and tasteful jewelry, but the face was unmistakably the same. Bradley's friends had melted away, distancing themselves from him with the practiced ease of people who understood that association with failure was contagious. His face had gone from grey to green, and he looked like he might be sick. I didn't know," he managed. "How was I supposed to know?" "That's precisely the point, Mr. Hartwell. You didn't know. You assumed. You looked at me and saw my skin color, my age, my clothing, and you made a decision about who I was and what I deserved. You treated me as less than human because you believed I was beneath you." Eleanor's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the silk. "But here's what I need you to understand. Even if I were exactly what you assumed me to be, Even if I were a cleaning woman with no money and no power and no connections, I would still deserve to be treated with basic human dignity. My worth as a person would not be diminished one iota. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the assembled guests. Too many people in this room witnessed what happened tonight and said nothing, did nothing. You watched a man humiliate and assault another human being, and your silence made you complicit. Your comfort was more important than her dignity. Your social standing was more valuable than her humanity. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Several of them couldn't meet her gaze. This gala was supposed to raise money for underprivileged youth. But how many of you truly believe that those young people deserve the same opportunities you've had? How many of you look at children from poor neighborhoods, children of color, children of immigrants, and see them as fully human, as worthy of respect, as capable of achieving everything you've achieved? She turned back to Bradley, who seemed to have shrunk inside his expensive tuxedo. Your foundation is a fraud, Mr. Hartwell. I've had my people investigate it thoroughly. Less than 8% of the money raised actually reaches the children you claim to serve. The rest disappears into administrative fees, consulting contracts awarded to family friends, and various other forms of legal theft. Bradley's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Over the past decade, your foundation has raised over $70 million for underprivileged youth. Do you know how much actually went to scholarships and programs? Less than $6 million. The rest was siphoned off through a network of shell companies, fake consulting firms, and inflated expense reports. Your family used charitable donations to fund vacations, purchase luxury vehicles, and pay for your sister's wedding, all while claiming to help children escape poverty. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I have copies of the financial records. I have testimony from former employees who were fired when they raised concerns. I have emails showing that your father personally approved the most egregious diversions of funds. Everything has been documented, verified, and prepared for submission to the appropriate authorities. Eleanor turned to face Margaret Hartwell, who had gone pale as a sheet. Your husband is a fraud, Mrs. Hartwell. Your son is an abuser. And your family's so-called charitable legacy is nothing but a mechanism for tax evasion and self-enrichment. The mask is off. The whole world is about to see you as you really are. Tomorrow morning, a full report on your foundation's finances will be delivered to the State Attorney General's office, along with a formal complaint. I've also taken the liberty of alerting several journalists who specialize in investigating charitable fraud. I suspect the next few weeks will be rather uncomfortable for your family. A woman pushed through the crowd and grabbed Bradley's arm. She was in her early 60s, elegantly dressed, with the rigid posture of someone who had spent a lifetime maintaining appearances. His mother, Margaret Hartwell, wife of Bradley Hartwell II and Queen of Connecticut High Society. This is outrageous, Margaret said, her voice high and sharp. How dare you threaten my son? How dare you make these accusations? Do you have any idea what the Hartwell family can do to you? Eleanor regarded her with the same calm, measured gaze she had turned on Bradley. I know exactly what your family can do, Mrs. Hartwell. I also know what I can do. And I promise you, my resources considerably exceed yours. She paused, allowing that to sink in. But that's not really the point, is it? The point is that your son threw a drink in a woman's face because he believed she was beneath him. The point is that he did it in front of hundreds of witnesses who were too intimidated or too indifferent to intervene. The point is that this kind of behavior is considered acceptable in certain circles, as long as the victim is the right kind of victim. Margaret Hartwell's face had gone pale. She opened her mouth to respond, but Eleanor raised a hand. I'm not finished. Your husband built his political career on law and order rhetoric, on promises to protect the vulnerable from predators. But his own son is the predator. His own foundation is the fraud, and I intend to make sure that everyone knows it. She turned to address the room one final time. "I bought this house because I wanted to remember where I came from. I wanted to remember what it felt like to serve, to be invisible, to be dismissed. I host events like this because I believe in the causes they claim to support. But tonight has reminded me that good intentions mean nothing without accountability." She walked toward the grand staircase that led to the upper floors of the mansion, her bearing regal despite her simple clothing. Every eye in the room followed her, transfixed by the transformation they had just witnessed. This woman, who had seemed so ordinary, so invisible, now commanded attention in a way that no diamond necklace or designer gown ever could. At the foot of the stairs, she paused and looked back. "The party is over. Please leave my home. All of you." The words were quiet, but carried an authority that none of the assembled guests could ignore. This was not a request. It was a command, delivered by someone who had every right and every power to enforce it. The room erupted into chaos. Guests began gathering their things, calling for their cars, whispering frantically to each other about what they had just witnessed. The Hartwell family stood frozen in the center of the ballroom, their social standing crumbling around them in real time. The reverberations of that moment would be felt for years to come, not just in the legal consequences that followed, but in the cultural shift that it represented. Eleanor Washington had done something that went far beyond exposing a single family's corruption. She had held up a mirror to an entire class of people and shown them what they looked like to those they considered beneath them. Bradley finally found his voice. "You can't do this," he shouted after Eleanor's retreating figure. "You can't just accuse my family of fraud without evidence. We'll sue you into the ground. We'll destroy you." Eleanor paused on the staircase and turned. The look she gave him was almost kind, the way a teacher might look at a particularly slow student who had just made an obvious mistake. "I'm a 62-year-old black woman who built a $15 billion company from nothing. I started with $1,000 and a dream, working out of a rented kitchen in a neighborhood where gunshots were more common than birdsong. I've been sued by governments, attacked by competitors, dismissed by every person who looked at me and saw only what they expected to see. And I'm still here. Still standing, still building." She smiled that small, transformative smile. "You, on the other hand, have never built anything in your life. You've never worked for anything. You've never faced a single genuine challenge. Everything you have was given to you by accident of birth. You're going to discover very soon that the privileges you've taken for granted your whole life are not nearly as solid as you believe them to be." She turned and continued up the stairs, disappearing into the shadows of the upper floor. Behind her, the grand ballroom descended into chaos. The next morning dawned bright and clear over the Connecticut countryside. Eleanor Washington sat in her private study on the third floor of the estate, watching the sun rise over the reflecting pool through floor-to-ceiling windows that had been installed specifically for this view. The room was filled with books and artwork and personal mementos from a life fully lived. On one wall hung her engineering degree from MIT, earned while working 2 jobs and raising her firstborn son. On another was a photograph of her with 3 former presidents, taken at various state dinners over the years. A display case contained awards and honors from every major business organization in the country. But the most treasured items were simpler. A worn Bible that had belonged to her grandmother, its pages soft and fragile from decades of use. A photograph of her mother, young and beautiful, taken before life had worn her down. A child's drawing, now carefully preserved and framed, showing a stick figure labeled Mommy, standing next to a tall building labeled Mommy's Company. Her children were grown now, both successful in their own right. Her son was a neurosurgeon in Boston, her daughter a professor of economics at Howard University. They had children of their own, Eleanor's beloved grandchildren, who visited every holiday and filled the enormous house with laughter and noise and the glorious chaos of young life. She had been blessed, impossibly, undeservedly blessed, and she had never forgotten it. She had showered and changed into comfortable clothing, her wet hair wrapped in a towel. A cup of coffee steamed on the table beside her, next to a tablet displaying the morning's news headlines. Billionaire reveals herself at charity gala, accuses prominent family of fraud. Hartwell Foundation under investigation after explosive allegations. Washington Dynamics CEO confronts wealthy Playboy in viral video. Ah, yes, the video. Eleanor had known that someone would be recording. People always were, at events like that. Several angles of Bradley throwing his drink in her face had already been viewed millions of times. The comment sections were exactly what she had expected, a mixture of outrage and support, with a depressing number of people defending Bradley's actions. There was a soft knock at the door. "Come in." Marcus entered, still looking slightly shell-shocked from the events of the previous night. He was 24 years old, a graduate student in social work who had been working at the estate as a summer job. He had no idea when he was hired that his employer was one of the wealthiest women in America. "Ms. Washington, there are several reporters at the gate, and about a dozen phone calls holding. Your assistant in New York is going a little crazy, trying to manage everything." Eleanor smiled. "Tell Patricia to handle it the way she always does. She's been with me for 30 years. She knows what to do." "Yes, ma'am." Marcus hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you do it? Dress like that, I mean. Pretend to be staff. You must have known something like this might happen." Eleanor considered the question carefully. It deserved a thoughtful answer. "When I was young," she began, "I really was a cleaning woman. I really did work at parties like that one. Invisible to the guests, picking up their discarded glasses and wiping up their spills. I remember how they looked at me, or rather, how they didn't look at me. I was furniture to them, less than furniture, really, because furniture at least gets noticed when it's out of place." She turned from the window to face Marcus directly. "I built my company because I wanted to prove that I was worth something, that I could achieve everything those wealthy, privileged people had, and more, and I did. But somewhere along the way, I realized that proving myself to them wasn't the point. The point was changing the system that made them believe they were better than me in the first place." "So you dress as a cleaning lady to catch people being jerks?" Eleanor laughed, a warm, genuine sound. "Not exactly. I dress as a cleaning lady to remind myself of who I was. Of who I still am, underneath all the money and the titles and the houses. And yes, sometimes it shows me who people really are when they think no one important is watching." "What's going to happen to Bradley Hartwell?" "That depends on a lot of factors. His family has money and connections. They'll hire good lawyers, mount a defense, try to spin the narrative. But the evidence against their foundation is solid. My investigators have been building the case for months, and the video of last night is going to make it very hard for anyone to feel sorry for him." Marcus nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry I didn't say anything. When he was talking to you like that, I wanted to, but you were afraid," Eleanor finished gently. "Afraid of losing your job, of making a scene, of challenging someone who seemed so much more powerful than you." "Yes. That's understandable. It's hard to stand up to power, especially when you feel like you have none yourself. But I want you to remember something, Marcus. The only power people like Bradley Hartwell really have is the power we give them. The power of our silence. The power of our compliance. The moment we stop pretending they're better than us, the moment we stop accepting their cruelty as the natural order of things, they become what they've always been underneath. Just people. Flawed, frightened, desperately insecure people who use wealth and status to hide their emptiness." Marcus stood quietly for a moment, absorbing her words. Then he nodded. "Is there anything you need, Ms. Washington? A fresh pot of coffee would be wonderful. And please, call me Eleanor. I think after last night, we're past formalities." After Marcus left, Eleanor returned to her window and her thoughts. The events of the previous evening had unfolded almost exactly as she had anticipated. She had known when she agreed to host the Hartwell Foundation Gala that she was inviting vipers into her home. She had known that Bradley's reputation preceded him, that his behavior at previous events had been tolerated and covered up by his family's influence. What she hadn't known, couldn't have known, was exactly when or how he would reveal himself. But she had been prepared for something like what had happened. The investigative report was ready. The journalists were already briefed. The wheels of accountability were oiled and waiting. Some would call it entrapment. Some would say she had set Bradley up, manufactured the confrontation, manipulated the situation for maximum impact. And perhaps there was some truth to that. But the fact remained that Bradley had made his own choices. He had chosen to mock and belittle a woman he perceived as beneath him. He had chosen to throw a drink in her face. He had chosen to reveal, in front of hundreds of witnesses, exactly who he was. All Eleanor had done was give him the opportunity. The story dominated the news cycle for weeks. The video of the confrontation was viewed hundreds of millions of times around the world. Think pieces were written about privilege and prejudice, about the invisibility of service workers, about the casual cruelty of the wealthy elite. Eleanor gave no interviews, made no public statements, let her actions speak for themselves. Social media exploded with commentary. The hashtag Eleanor Washington trended for days, joined by related hashtags like Believe Her and Service Workers Deserve Respect. People shared their own stories of being mistreated by wealthy clients, of being looked through and dismissed, of being treated as less than human because of their jobs. The video became a cultural touchstone, referenced in late-night monologues and morning show discussions. Comedians created parodies. Artists created paintings and digital artwork depicting the moment of Eleanor's reveal. Her image appeared on T-shirts and coffee mugs, always accompanied by her most memorable words: "The shame belongs to those who look down on the people who serve them." The investigation into the Hartwell Foundation moved swiftly once the Attorney General became involved. Financial records were subpoenaed, witnesses were interviewed. A pattern of misappropriation and fraud emerged that went back decades, implicating not just the foundation, but several family members who had used it as a personal piggy bank. The evidence was damning: bank statements showing transfers from the foundation to personal accounts, credit card bills charged to the charity for luxury goods and exotic vacations. A paper trail of corruption so blatant that even the Hartwell's expensive lawyers couldn't explain it away. Bradley Hartwell III was charged with assault based on the video evidence from the gala. It was a misdemeanor, unlikely to result in jail time for a first-time offender with expensive lawyers. But the charge itself was a humiliation he had never experienced. His face was everywhere, his moment of cruelty replayed endlessly, his name synonymous with entitled brutality. His mugshot, taken after he surrendered to police, showed a man stripped of his arrogance. Without his perfectly styled hair and expensive clothes, without the entourage of hangers-on and the shield of family wealth, he looked small, diminished, ordinary. The image went viral, paired with screenshots from the gala video. Before and after, the arrogant Playboy and the defeated defendant. The contrast was stark and deeply satisfying to the millions who had watched his cruelty and longed for consequences. His father's political ambitions crumbled under the weight of the scandal. Bradley Hartwell II had been planning a run for governor, but no amount of spin could overcome the images of his son throwing a drink at a 62-year-old black woman while calling her the help. The donors fled. The endorsements evaporated. The dream of higher office died. The senior Hartwell tried everything to salvage his reputation. He gave interviews expressing disappointment in his son. He announced new oversight measures for the foundation. He even made a substantial donation to a civil rights organization, a transparent attempt to buy goodwill that was met with derision by the very communities he was trying to impress. None of it worked. The video was too damning. The evidence of fraud was too extensive. And the public, fed up with years of wealthy families escaping consequences for their actions, was in no mood for redemption arcs. Bradley Hartwell II announced his retirement from public life 3 months after the gala. He cited health concerns, but everyone knew the truth. His political career was over, destroyed by his son's cruelty and his own corruption. Margaret Hartwell attempted damage control, giving interviews in which she portrayed her son as a victim of entrapment and her family as targets of a vindictive billionaire with an axe to grind. But the public wasn't buying it. The video was too clear. The words were too damning. The pattern of behavior, revealed by former employees and acquaintances who now felt safe to speak, was too consistent. Former maids and drivers came forward with their own stories. A nanny who had been fired without severance after 20 years of service. A gardener who had been accused of theft and nearly arrested on Bradley's word alone, saved only by security camera footage that proved his innocence. A caterer who had been publicly humiliated at a holiday party and blackballed from every event on the Connecticut social circuit. Story after story emerged, painting a picture of a family that had used their wealth and power to abuse the people who worked for them for generations. The Hartwell name, once synonymous with philanthropy and public service, became a byword for cruelty and corruption. The Hartwells retreated from public life, licking their wounds in their various estates, watching their carefully constructed reputation crumble around them. Some said they had fled to Europe, unable to bear the judgment of the society that had once celebrated them. Others said they were hiding in their Connecticut compound, surrounded by security guards, waiting for the storm to pass. Eleanor didn't know or care where they had gone. Her concern had never been revenge, it had been justice and accountability, and making sure that the Hartwells could never hurt anyone else the way they had hurt so many before. And Eleanor Washington went back to work. 3 months after the gala, she announced a major new initiative. The Washington Foundation for Educational Excellence would provide full scholarships to underprivileged students across the country, covering not just tuition, but living expenses, books, and support services. The initial endowment was $500 million, with a commitment to raise it to $1 billion within 5 years. "This is what a real educational charity looks like," Eleanor said at the press conference announcing the initiative. "Transparent finances, measurable outcomes, actual impact on actual lives. I challenge every wealthy family in America to match this commitment, not with tax shelters and self-congratulation, but with genuine investment in the next generation." The response was overwhelming. Applications poured in from across the country. Other billionaires, shamed by the contrast between Eleanor's initiative and the exposed fraud of the Hartwell Foundation, announced their own increased giving. The national conversation about charitable accountability shifted perceptibly. But for Eleanor, the most meaningful moments came not in press conferences or boardrooms, but in quiet, personal encounters. She thought often about her mother during those months, about the woman who had worked herself to exhaustion so that her children could have a better life, about the sacrifices made without complaint, the dreams deferred without bitterness, the love poured out unconditionally despite having so little else to give. Her mother had died at 58, worn out by years of physical labor and chronic stress. She had lived just long enough to see Eleanor graduate from college, the first person in their family to earn a degree. She had wept with pride at the ceremony, clutching Eleanor's hand so tightly that it left marks. "You did it," she had whispered. "You really did it. I always knew you would." 6 months later, she was gone. A heart attack, the doctors said. Eleanor always believed it was more than that, believed that her mother's heart had simply given out after years of carrying too heavy a burden, that she had held on just long enough to see her daughter succeed and then allowed herself to rest at last. Eleanor carried that memory with her everywhere. It was the fuel that powered her ambition, the compass that guided her decisions, the voice that whispered in her ear during the darkest moments. She had built her empire not for herself, but for her mother, for the grandmother who had survived Jim Crow and never stopped believing in better days, for the great-grandmother who had been born into slavery and died in freedom, for all the Washington women who had come before, each one laying another stone in the foundation that Eleanor now stood upon. One afternoon, about 6 months after the gala, she was visiting a community center in the Bronx that her foundation had helped fund. She was dressed simply, as she often was when visiting the neighborhoods where her money actually made a difference, and she was walking through the building with the center's director when a young girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old, ran up to her. "You're the lady from the video," the girl exclaimed, "the one where that mean man threw the drink at you." Eleanor smiled down at her. "That's right. I'm Eleanor. I watched it like 100 times. My mum said it was important for me to see." The girl's eyes were shining with something that looked like wonder. "You're really a billionaire? Like for real? For real? But you were dressed like a regular person, like my grandma when she goes to work. Your grandmother sounds like a smart woman. What does she do?" "She cleans offices at night. She's been doing it since before I was born. She says it's honest work and nothing to be ashamed of." Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest. "Your grandmother is absolutely right. There's no work more honest than keeping the world clean and running. I cleaned offices too, you know, and houses, and hotels. I did whatever work needed to be done." Destiny's eyes widened even more. "But you're so rich now. How did that happen?" Eleanor glanced at the center's director, who nodded encouragingly. This was exactly the kind of conversation the center was meant to foster. Role models connecting with young people, dreams being kindled in hearts that had been told they couldn't dream. "Would you like to sit down?" Eleanor asked. "It's a bit of a long story." They found a quiet corner with 2 plastic chairs, and Eleanor told Destiny a version of her story, simplified for a 10-year-old, but no less true for its simplicity. "I was always good at solving problems," Eleanor began. "Even when I was little, I liked to figure out how things worked. I would take apart old radios and clocks and put them back together. Sometimes they even worked better when I was done." Destiny giggled. "Sometimes?" "Well, mostly. The point is, I loved understanding how things worked. And when I got older, I realized that I could use that love to help people. I went to college on a scholarship, studied engineering, and learned how to build things that could make a difference." "What kind of things?" "All kinds. Equipment that helps doctors do their jobs better. Technology that keeps soldiers safe. Systems that help planes fly and ships sail and buildings stand up straight." Eleanor smiled at the memory of those early years, working 20-hour days in a cramped kitchen, convinced that she was building something that mattered. But at first, it was just me and an idea. I didn't have money or connections or fancy degrees from fancy schools. I just had a belief that I could do something important and the willingness to work harder than anyone else to prove it. Weren't you scared? Every single day. But I was more scared of not trying, more scared of waking up one day and realizing I'd never given myself a chance. So I kept going, even when it was hard, even when everyone told me to give up. Destiny was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Then she asked, "What happened with the man who threw the drink at you?" Eleanor's smile faded slightly. "He's facing consequences for his actions. Legal consequences, social consequences, professional consequences. But you know what, Destiny? The most important thing isn't what happens to him. It's what happens to the people he hurt and the people who learned from watching what he did." "Like what?" "Like you. You watched that video and learned something about how the world works. About how some people think they're better than others because of how much money they have or what color their skin is. And now you know that's not true. You know that a woman who looks like your grandmother can also be someone who owns a mansion and runs a company and stands up to bullies without flinching." Destiny nodded slowly, processing this. "So it's like you showed everybody." I showed everybody who was willing to see, and that's important, Destiny. Some people will never learn, no matter what you show them, but some people will. And for those people, for kids like you who need to know that the world is bigger than what they've been told, it's worth it. It's worth everything. Eleanor knelt down so she was at eye level with the girl. What's your name, sweetheart? Destiny. Destiny Williams. Destiny. I want you to know something. When I was your age, my mother cleaned offices too. She cleaned houses and offices and hotel rooms. She worked harder than anyone I've ever known, and she never complained because she was doing it for me and my brothers. That's why I dressed the way I did that night, to honor her, to remember where I came from, and to show the world that people like your grandmother, people who work hard and do honest work, deserve respect. Not because of how much money they have, but because of who they are. Destiny's eyes widened. My mom says I can be anything I want to be, a doctor or a lawyer or even president. Do you think that's true? I think your mother is absolutely right. And I think you can be anything you dream of being. That's why my foundation exists. To make sure that kids like you have the same opportunities that kids from wealthy families have. Because talent is everywhere, but opportunity isn't, and it should be. The center's director had been watching the exchange with tears in her eyes. When Eleanor stood up, the woman touched her arm gently. You have no idea what this means to these kids. To see someone who looks like them, who came from where they came from, standing at the top of the world, it changes what they believe is possible. That's exactly why I do it, Eleanor said. Not for the credit or the headlines, for destiny, for all the destinies out there who need to know that their dreams are valid. As she left the community center that afternoon, Eleanor thought about the strange path her life had taken, from a housing project in Chicago to the heights of American industry, from cleaning other people's houses to owning one of the most valuable estates in Connecticut, from invisibility to influence. But the journey hadn't changed who she was. It had only revealed it more clearly. She had always been this person, strong, determined, unwilling to accept the limitations others tried to place on her. The money and the success were just external manifestations of something that had always been inside her, a fire that refused to be extinguished, no matter how many people tried to stamp it out. The night of the gala had been a reminder of why that fire was necessary. There were still Bradley Hartwells in the world, people who looked at others and saw only what they expected to see, who used their power to humiliate and diminish those they considered beneath them. And there were still millions of people who suffered in silence, who accepted mistreatment because they believed they had no choice, who had been taught by a lifetime of experience that their voices didn't matter. Eleanor's job, as she saw it, was to prove them wrong, to show that the silent could become powerful, that the invisible could become undeniable, that the systems designed to keep people in their place could be challenged and changed and ultimately dismantled. It was a big job, too big for one person, even a person with $15 billion and a lot of determination. But Eleanor had never been daunted by big jobs. She had started her company with $1,000 and a dream. She had built it into an empire through decades of hard work and strategic thinking. She had overcome obstacles that would have stopped most people in their tracks. This was just another obstacle, a bigger one perhaps, a more complex one. But the same principles applied. Work hard, stay focused, never forget where you came from or who you're fighting for. And always stand up for yourself and others when it matters most. A year after the gala, Eleanor received an unexpected letter. It was handwritten, which was unusual in the age of email, and it bore no return address. She opened it curiously, wondering what it could contain. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, the kind of stationery that spoke of old money and traditional values. But the handwriting inside was shaky, uncertain, the words of someone struggling to express something difficult. The letter was from Thomas Whitfield, the man who had been part of Bradley's group that night, the one who had looked uncomfortable and suggested that Bradley keep his voice down. "Dear Ms. Washington, I've been trying to write this letter for months. I'm not sure I'll ever send it, but I need to try to put into words what I've been thinking since that night at the gala. I was there when Bradley threw that drink at you. I was standing right there, close enough to stop him if I'd wanted to. But I didn't want to, or rather I wanted to, but I was too afraid. Afraid of what Bradley would think. Afraid of being ostracized from our social circle. Afraid of the minor inconvenience of standing up for a stranger. I've thought about that moment every day since. I've thought about what it says about me that I stood there and watched and did nothing, that I laughed along with the others when he made his cruel jokes, that I was more concerned with my own comfort than with your dignity. The truth is, I've been complicit in behavior like Bradley's for my entire life. I've stood by while people were mistreated because I didn't want to make waves. I've benefited from systems of privilege without ever questioning them. I've told myself that I was one of the good ones because I didn't actively participate in cruelty while ignoring the fact that my silence made it possible. I grew up in a world where people like me never had to think about people like you. We were insulated from consequence, protected from discomfort, raised to believe that our way of life was natural and right. We went to the same schools, joined the same clubs, married into the same families. The people who cleaned our houses and served our food and maintained our gardens were invisible to us, background players in a story that was all about our needs and desires. I see now how wrong that was, how dehumanizing, how corrosive to my own soul as much as to the people I failed to see. I'm not writing this letter to ask for forgiveness. I don't think I deserve it. I'm writing because I want you to know that what happened that night changed me. Watching you stand there with that drink dripping down your face, with more dignity than Bradley has ever had in his entire life. It broke something in me, something that needed to be broken. I've left my old social circle. I've started volunteering at a legal aid clinic that serves low-income families. I've had difficult conversations with my parents and siblings about the way we've lived our lives, the assumptions we've made, the people we've hurt. It's been uncomfortable and painful, and I know I have years of work ahead of me. My parents think I've lost my mind. My old friends have stopped calling. My fiancée broke off our engagement because she said I'd become too political, but for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm becoming the person I should have been all along. But I wanted you to know that you made a difference. Not just in the big ways, the foundation and the investigations and the national conversation, but in the small ways too. In the conscience of one cowardly man who finally decided to try to be better. Thank you for your courage. I hope someday I can have even a fraction of it. Sincerely, Thomas Whitfield. Eleanor read the letter twice, then set it down on her desk and looked out the window at the Connecticut afternoon. The sky was clear and blue, the kind of day that made everything seem possible. She thought about Thomas Whitfield, about the journey he was beginning, about the difficulty of examining one's own privilege, of acknowledging complicity, of choosing to change when change was hard and uncertain and uncomfortable. It would have been easy to dismiss his letter as self-serving, as an attempt to assuage his own guilt without actually changing anything, and maybe it was, partially. But Eleanor had learned over her 62 years that people were complicated, that redemption was possible, that the same person could be cowardly one moment and courageous the next. She believed in second chances. She had to. Her entire life was a testament to the power of second chances, of opportunities that shouldn't have existed, of doors that opened when they were supposed to be closed. So she picked up a pen and wrote a response. Dear Thomas, thank you for your letter. I know it wasn't easy to write. Change is hard. Looking honestly at ourselves and our actions is one of the most difficult things anyone can do. The fact that you're willing to try, that you're doing the uncomfortable work of examining your privilege and your complicity, that means something. I don't believe in condemning people forever for their worst moments. I believe in growth, in transformation, in the possibility that we can become better than we've been. If I didn't believe that, I would have given up long ago. Keep going. Keep questioning. Keep pushing yourself to be better. And when you see something wrong, something cruel, something unjust, speak up. Not because it's comfortable, but because it's right. That's all any of us can do. Try to be better today than we were yesterday. And keep trying, even when we fail. Eleanor Washington. She sealed the letter and set it aside to be mailed. Then she turned back to her work. There were scholarships to fund, communities to support, systems to challenge, minds to change. The work never ended. But that was okay. Eleanor Washington had never been afraid of hard work. 2 years after the gala, a young woman named Destiny Williams received a letter that would change her life. She had been accepted to Stanford University on a full scholarship from the Washington Foundation for Educational Excellence. All expenses paid, all support provided. A chance at a future she had barely dared to dream of. The letter arrived on a grey February morning, slipped through the mail slot of the small apartment where Destiny lived with her grandmother and mother. She had almost missed it among the bills and junk mail, but something about the heavy cream-colored envelope caught her eye. When she opened it, when she read the words printed on the thick paper inside, she screamed so loudly that her grandmother came running from the kitchen, convinced something terrible had happened. Destiny's grandmother wept when she heard the news. 30 years of cleaning offices, of aching knees and tired hands, of sacrifices too numerous to count. And now this. Her granddaughter was going to Stanford. Her granddaughter was going to have the life she had always dreamed of for her. "You see," the grandmother said through her tears, clutching the letter like it was made of gold, "I told you. I always told you. You can be anything." Destiny hugged her grandmother tightly, thinking about a day 2 years earlier when a woman in simple clothes had knelt down to her level and told her that her dreams were valid. That woman had been dressed like a cleaning lady, just like her grandmother. And that woman had become one of the most powerful people in the country. If she could do it, maybe Destiny could too. The scholarship covered everything. Tuition, room and board, books, travel, even a small stipend for personal expenses. But more than the money, the Washington Foundation provided mentorship, support services, and a community of other scholars who understood what it meant to come from nothing and reach for everything. Far away in Connecticut, Eleanor Washington sat in her study, reading through the latest batch of acceptance letters for her foundation's scholarship recipients. Each one represented a life transformed, a door opened, a future made possible. There were hundreds of them now, and there would be thousands more in the years to come. She thought about Bradley Hartwell, who had pleaded guilty to assault and been sentenced to community service. The last she'd heard, he was required to work at a homeless shelter, serving meals to people he would once have looked right through. Whether the experience was actually changing him or just humiliating him, she didn't know. That was his journey to make. She thought about Thomas Whitfield, who had sent her a card at Christmas, updating her on his work at the legal aid clinic. He had helped a single mother avoid eviction. He had assisted an elderly man in navigating the bureaucracy of Medicare. Small victories, he called them, but they felt larger than anything he'd ever done before. She thought about her mother, gone now for 20 years, who had never lived to see her daughter's success, who had died believing that Eleanor would be okay, but never knowing just how okay she would become. She thought about the sacrifices her mother had made, the indignities she had endured, the love she had poured into her children despite having so little else to give. "I did it, Mama," Eleanor whispered to the empty room. "I did it for all of us." The sun was setting over the reflecting pool, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Another day ending, another day of work and hope and slow, steady progress. Eleanor Washington closed her laptop and stood up from her desk. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to make a difference. But for now, she was going to take a walk in her garden, enjoy the evening air, and remember how far she had come. From a housing project in Chicago to the owner of a Connecticut estate. From invisible to undeniable, from powerless to powerful. But always, always the same person underneath. The same determination, the same fire, the same refusal to accept the limitations others tried to place on her. That was the secret, really. The one thing she wished she could tell every young person she met. Every destiny out there dreaming of bigger things. You don't become someone else when you succeed. You just become more fully yourself. And that self, that authentic, uncompromising, unapologetic self, was always worth fighting for. The evening air was cool and fragrant with the scent of roses. Eleanor walked slowly through the garden, letting her mind wander. She thought about the gala, about Bradley's face when she revealed who she was, about the shock and horror and sudden understanding that had rippled through the crowd. It had been satisfying, she admitted to herself, deeply, profoundly satisfying, not because she had enjoyed humiliating Bradley, although she'd be lying if she said she hadn't felt a certain grim pleasure in watching him squirm, but because she had proven something important, something that needed to be proven over and over again until the lesson finally sank in. Never underestimate anyone. Never assume you know someone's story based on how they look, or what they're wearing, or what job they seem to be doing. Never believe that your privilege makes you better than anyone else. These were simple lessons. Obvious lessons, really, the kind of things that should be taught in kindergarten and reinforced throughout a lifetime. But somehow, people like Bradley Hartwell managed to reach adulthood without learning them, and it was the people on the receiving end of their arrogance who paid the price. Eleanor had been one of those people. She had spent years being looked through, dismissed, underestimated. She remembered every slight, every condescending glance, every moment when someone had assumed she was less than she was because of her race or her gender or her economic circumstances. Those memories had fueled her, driven her, made her work harder and push further, and refuse to accept any ceiling placed over her head. She had used other people's low expectations as motivation, turning every "you can't" into a "watch me." And now, here she was, walking through her own garden, in her own estate, with enough money and power to shape the world according to her vision. But the money and power weren't the point. They were just tools. The point was what you did with them. Eleanor stopped beside a particularly beautiful rosebush, one she had planted herself shortly after purchasing the estate. It had bloomed spectacularly this year, its deep red flowers a testament to patience and care. She thought about Destiny Williams, getting ready for Stanford, about Thomas Whitfield, finding meaning in service to others, about Marcus, who had gone on to graduate school with a letter of recommendation from Eleanor herself, about the hundreds of scholarship recipients and community center visitors and small business owners who had been touched, directly or indirectly, by her work. These were her real achievements. Not the billions in her bank account or the estate around her or the magazine covers and television interviews, but the lives changed, the opportunities created, the injustices challenged. That was her legacy. That was what would endure long after she was gone. The sun slipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in shades of purple and deep blue. Stars were beginning to appear, first one, then another, then dozens more, scattered across the darkness like diamonds on black velvet. Eleanor looked up at them and smiled. "Thank you, Mama," she whispered again, "for everything, for working so hard, for believing in me, for teaching me that I was worth something, even when the world tried to tell me otherwise." She stood in the garden for a long time, watching the stars emerge, thinking about the past and the future and the eternal present moment where all real change happened. Then she turned and walked back toward the house. There was still work to do. There always would be. But that was okay. Eleanor Washington had never been afraid of work, and she never ever forgot where she came from. That was the true measure of Eleanor Washington's success. Not the billions in her bank accounts, not the properties she owned, not the magazine covers or the television appearances, or the awards lining her shelves. The true measure was this: she had never lost herself. Never forgotten the housing project in Chicago, the mother who worked herself to exhaustion, the grandmother who had believed in better days, the great-grandmother who had been born in chains. She carried them all with her every day. They were her strength, her compass, her conscience. They reminded her of who she was and what she was fighting for. They kept her humble when success threatened to make her arrogant, and they kept her strong when failure threatened to make her despair. Eleanor Washington had built an empire. She had confronted the privileged and the powerful. She had changed lives and shifted conversations and proven that one person, starting with nothing, could achieve absolutely anything. But her greatest achievement was simpler than that. Her greatest achievement was remaining after everything exactly who she had always been. A woman who worked hard, a woman who believed in justice, a woman who never forgot the people who served because she had been one of them. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.